Granite Notch Pass had been erased from the earth. Snow drove sideways through the absolute darkness, propelled by wind that slammed into the Bitterroot Mountains hard enough to snap century-old pines in half. The temperature was 25 degrees below zero. Out here, in the teeth of the White Hammer, exposure didn't kill slowly. It stopped the human heart in 40 minutes. Yet, beneath the colossal roots of an uprooted Douglas fir, a man was not freezing. His name was Kellen Foss. He lay trapped in a space so suffocatingly small he couldn't roll onto his shoulders. The entrance was blocked by the heavy oak bed of a shattered buckboard wagon. Every crack, every jagged seam between the dead wood and the granite earth had been frantically packed with frozen mud, pine needles, and torn canvas. Outside, the blizzard screamed, hunting for him. In a tiny side pocket beneath the rock shelf, a frost-covered draft mule named Juniper breathed heavily, its massive body trembling against the storm's vibrations. Inside the coffin-sized void, a single candle stub burned in a dented tin cup. Kellen didn't blink. He watched the flame. A dead branch cracked like a gunshot overhead. The canvas tarp shuddered wildly. The frozen dirt hissed as ice scoured its surface. But the tiny yellow flame never moved. It stood perfectly straight. That fragile light proved something the furious storm outside couldn't comprehend. The wind was a demon, but for now, it hadn't found a way inside. To understand how a broken wagon and a dead tree became the warmest room in the mountains, you have to go back to a mistake Kellen made. 2 days earlier, the world had looked very different. Morning light rested quietly across the small valley where Kellen lived with Mara and their young son Caleb. The place was nothing special by frontier standards. A narrow field stretched behind the cabin. A shallow well stood beside the barn. A low fence marked the property line. Smoke drifted from the stovepipe while Mara worked near the kitchen table. The land was modest. It was also everything they had. That same morning, Silas Greer arrived carrying a folded document. The warehouse owner said very little. He simply laid the paper on the table and reminded Kellen that the debt would come due before the deep winter settled across the valley. One payment remained. Miss it, and the land would no longer belong to the Voss family. After Silas left, the paper disappeared into Kellen's coat pocket. By noon, he had accepted a freight contract bound for a mining camp beyond Granite Notch Pass. Most teamsters had already stopped taking mountain deliveries for the season. November roads carried too much risk. The pay, however, was enough to clear the debt. Caleb stood near the barn door as Kellen checked the wagon. "Will you be back before the snow covers the fence?" the boy asked. Kellen glanced toward the distant mountains. "Before the deep snow," he replied. Mara spent most of the afternoon beside the wagon. A needle moved steadily through torn canvas, while scraps of old cloth disappeared into worn places that had seen too many roads. The cover looked tired, but it would serve a little longer. Nearby, Kellen checked every piece of equipment he owned. Axle, wheel hub, lantern, rope, blanket, Dutch oven, tool roll. Nothing was new. Everything still worked. Caleb appeared carrying a short strip of leather. "If the wagon breaks," he said, offering it to his father, "you can use this." Kellen accepted it without a smile and slipped it into an inside pocket. Mara glanced toward the patched canvas. "Will that hold another storm?" His eyes lingered on the wagon for a moment. "It only has to hold one more trip." The following morning, the wagon rolled into the freight yard below town. Amos Rusk, a former freight boss who had spent decades moving cargo through mountain country, circled it slowly. His expression grew darker with each step. The front axle had already been repaired more than once. The left rear wheel carried a slight wobble. The canvas cover looked thin. Only one mule stood in the traces. Amos stopped beside the wagon. Granite Notch in late November isn't a road for a single mule. Kellen adjusted a cargo strap. "It's the road I have." Amos rested a hand on the sideboard. "That wagon's asking for trouble." The older man was not trying to win an argument. He was stating a fact. A few yards away, Lige Morrow, a young freight teamster hoping to earn his own mountain routes one day, watched with the curiosity of youth. The wagon looked old even by frontier standards. Near the warehouse door, Silas Greer listened without interruption. Then he spoke. A man can lose land by staying home, too. Silence settled over the yard. Kellen picked up the freight manifest, signed his name, and handed the paper back. The risk had already been measured. Now it was time to leave. The freight yard disappeared behind him before noon. Ahead waited Granite Notch Pass. At first, the weather seemed harsh but manageable. By early afternoon, however, something strange happened. It wasn't the arrival of a storm. It was the sudden, suffocating cessation of everything. The wind died. The pines stopped swaying. The loose snow on the frozen ground lay dead still. The silence grew so thick it made his ears ring. Kellen's head snapped up, cold sweat trickling down his spine. Anyone who had lived long enough in the Bitterroots knew exactly what this dead calm meant. The barometric pressure was plummeting. The mountain was sucking all the air into its lungs, preparing for a devastating blow, a phenomenon the mountain men called the White Hammer. He looked toward the northwest. A wall of solid cloud, the color of bruised blood and cold iron, was rolling in. He estimated less than 2 hours before Granite Notch disappeared inside a whiteout. Kellen knew his death clock was ticking. If he didn't find absolute shelter before the first blast hit the pass, the blood in his veins would freeze solid before nightfall. "Get up! Move! Juniper!" Kellen shouted, snapping the reins. They had to clear this exposed stretch of the pass immediately. The wagon accelerated dangerously over the slick, frozen road. The first disaster arrived minutes later. In his desperate rush against time, the wagon's right front wheel slid across a rock hidden beneath a patch of invisible black ice. The entire weight of the iron-heavy load shifted and slammed down on a single point. Crack! The sound of splitting oak echoed like a cannon shot. The front axle snapped clean in half. The wagon dropped violently to one side. Cargo slammed against the sideboards. Juniper panicked. The mule lunged forward with enough force to tear loose half the harness. Kellen ran. Snow slipped beneath his boots. He nearly fell. A second later, both arms wrapped around the animal's neck. The mule fought him, then trembled, then fought again. Kellen kept talking quietly until the panic began to fade. "Easy. I'm right here," he panted, forcing his own heart rate down to project calm to the animal, even as his own panic spiked. A few seconds of struggle felt like a century. Finally, Juniper stopped thrashing, its chest heaving. Kellen turned his bloodshot eyes toward the crippled wagon, then up at the incoming black wall of clouds. The axle was shattered. A repair would take half a day. His escape route was cut off. The mountain had officially sprung its trap. He was completely stranded on a deadly pass. He had less than 90 minutes. The thought hammered at Kellen's temples. Panic began clawing at the edges of his sanity. Abandoning the cargo, he scrambled up a granite outcrop, his eyes frantically scanning the barren slope. No cabin, no smoke, no rock shelter, nothing. The pass offered no mercy. Then he spotted something unusual. About 70 yards away, a massive ponderosa pine lay across a granite shelf. The tree had been dead for months. Most men would have ignored it. Kellen didn't. The space beneath the trunk carried almost no snow. That detail stopped him. Wind had swept across the entire slope all day. Yet, somehow the area under the tree remained mostly clear. Kellen narrowed his eyes. The storm had already revealed something important. The air moved over the pine, not through it. For the first time since the axle broke, Kellen saw a possible way to survive the night. The fallen pine demanded a closer look. Kellen charged down the slope, his boots punching through the crust of snow. When he reached the massive trunk, he dropped to his knees and scrambled into the dark space beneath it. He quickly measured the dimensions with his eyes and hands. The cavity was roughly 11 feet long and just under 3 feet high. The uprooted root plate formed a solid wall against the northwest. The heavy trunk served as a sturdy roof. The granite shelf provided a back wall. It had 3 walls, but the eastern side was wide open. A sharp gust of wind suddenly funneled through that 8-foot gap, biting through his coat like a physical blade. The cruel reality hit him instantly. This wasn't a shelter. It was a wind tunnel. If the blizzard caught him in here, the funneling air would strip away his body heat in less than 30 minutes. It would become a perfect ice coffin. Kellen sat back on his heels. He had 3 walls. He desperately needed a 4th. He crawled out from under the pine and looked back toward the trail. The wrecked buckboard wagon sat useless in the rising wind. The heavy oak wagon bed measured exactly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. A spark flared in his mind, sharp as a knife. His grandfather's voice echoed from a memory decades old. "You don't need a fire, boy. You just need to seal every path the wind can take." He didn't see a broken wagon anymore. He saw his 4th wall, and it was sitting 70 yards away, weighing 400 pounds. The decision would have looked insane to anyone watching. But Kellen didn't hesitate. He reached the crippled buckboard, the sledgehammer gripped tight in his bleeding hands. There would be no repair. Not today. Not ever. He raised the heavy hammer and swung it down hard against the rusted iron bolts, anchoring the bed to the frame. Clang! The violent sound of metal striking metal echoed against the rising howl of the wind. Sparks flew. Wood splintered. He didn't bother with a wrench. He used raw, desperate brute force. Every swing cost him precious oxygen. Every minute brought the black wall of the storm closer. Juniper stood tied nearby, shivering but waiting. Kellen paused only for a fraction of a second when his eyes fell on the freight. The medicine crates, the flour, the massive mill gear. Some of it might survive, some of it wouldn't. The math in his head was no longer about paying off a debt to Silas Greer. It was about drawing breath tomorrow. With one final guttural yell, he brought the hammer down. The last iron pin gave way. The heavy oak wagon bed disconnected completely from the shattered running gear. Most men would have mourned a ruined livelihood. Kellen saw a wall, saw a chance. Now, he just had to figure out how to move it. The work began immediately. Kellen threaded a length of rope through the stake pockets and wrapped the loose end across one shoulder. Then he leaned forward and pulled. Nothing happened. For a moment, the wagon bed seemed rooted to the mountain. He adjusted his footing and pulled again. Wood shifted. Only an inch. That inch was enough. The heavy platform scraped across frozen ground with a low grinding sound. Snow packed beneath the runners. Small rocks caught the edges. Twice he had to stop and pry the load free, with a lever cut from a fallen branch. Progress came slowly. A few feet. Then another few feet. The storm clouds continued spreading overhead while the daylight weakened around him. Several times the wagon bed threatened to wedge itself between exposed roots and granite outcrops. Each obstacle demanded another adjustment, another push, another pull. Patience mattered as much as strength. When the steepest section finally appeared, Kellen brought Juniper forward. The mule helped for a short distance, easing the load through a narrow stretch of uneven ground. He released the animal almost immediately afterward. One panic-driven bolt could ruin everything. The rest would have to be done by hand. Minutes disappeared. Then more. By the time nearly 50 minutes had passed, sweat dampened the back of his shirt despite the cold. The fallen pine stood directly ahead. Kellen took a long breath. The final maneuver required precision. Using the lever, he rotated the wagon bed until its long side faced the opening beneath the trunk. One corner slipped into position. Another followed. Then came the last push. Boots dug into frozen soil. Shoulders strained. Wood groaned. The wagon bed slid forward and settled beneath a fallen tree. For the first time, the shape of the shelter became visible. A granite wall stood behind it. The pine formed a roof above it. The broken wagon now guarded the front. Kellen collapsed to one knee after the effort ended. His chest heaved. His arms burned. The temptation to rest lasted only a few seconds. The mountains offered no reward for exhaustion. The storm was still coming. Building the shelter took less imagination than most people would have expected. What it demanded was attention. Kellen started with the largest opening. The patched canvas Mara had repaired only days earlier came off the wagon and stretched across the upper gap between the wagon bed and the fallen pine. Wind would strike there first. Any weakness would be exposed quickly. Next came the branches. Dry pine boughs formed a rough outer layer. Their purpose was not insulation. They simply occupied space that moving air might otherwise claim. The side gaps required something different. Dead bunch grass disappeared into narrow seams by the armful. Loose forest duff followed, frozen dirt packed against the lower edges where the wagon met the ground. Every handful reduced another pathway. The work continued without pause. Torn sections of saddle blanket filled places where the canvas no longer reached. Beneath the exposed root shelf, Kellen found patches of dry beard lichen and old moss protected from recent weather. He gathered them carefully and pushed them into cracks too small for grass. Those tiny openings worried him most. Large gaps announced themselves. Small ones hid. A needle-thin stream of air could steal more warmth than it appeared capable of carrying. Gradually, the shelter changed shape. The materials looked mismatched. Canvas, grass, dirt, branches, old blanket, moss. None of them were impressive alone. Together, they forced the wind to work harder. At one corner of the wagon bed, Kellen stopped and reached into his coat. The short strip of leather Caleb had given him earlier rested exactly where he had placed it. He threaded it through a stake pocket and tied down a loose section of canvas. For a brief moment, his hands became still. Then he pulled the knot tight. Only one opening remained, a vent no wider than a man's wrist. It faced away from the approaching storm. Everything else was sealed. Now the mountain would decide whether it was enough. At first, the shelter looked promising. Kellen crawled inside and pulled the canvas flap behind him. The space felt cramped, but that had never concerned him. Large shelters required large amounts of heat. Small shelters only required discipline. He struck a match. A short candle stub caught flame and filled the darkness with a weak yellow glow. For several seconds, everything appeared perfect. The flame stood upright. Nothing moved. Then it happened. The tip leaned slightly, only a fraction, barely enough to notice. Kellen narrowed his eyes. A moment later, he felt it. A thin stream of cold air brushed across his wrist. The sensation lasted less than a second, yet it told him everything he needed to know. Somewhere near the ground line, beneath the wagon bed, the wind had found a path. The opening could not have been large. It did not need to be. The mountain wasn't searching for a doorway. A crack would do. Kellen extinguished the candle immediately and backed out of the shelter. The repair began at once. Using his shovel, he cut frozen dirt from the slope and mixed it with snow crust and forest duff. The heavy mixture was packed tightly along the base of the wagon wall. Layer after layer built a low berm against the seam. When that was finished, pine boughs were stacked outside the barrier. They served a simple purpose. Once the storm arrived, drifting snow would catch against the branches and collect where he wanted it. Nature would finish the wall for him. Only then did Kellen crawl back inside. The candle flared to life once more. This time the flame remained steady. Watching that tiny light, he understood something that chilled him more than the wind. Had he gone to sleep without finding that leak, Mara would have become a widow before sunrise. The shelter could keep a man alive. Whether it could keep a mule alive remained a different question. Kellen stepped back into the growing wind and looked toward Juniper. The animal stood where he had tied it, head lowered, snow already gathering along its back. Leaving the mule exposed was not an option. A freight wagon could be replaced. A good animal could not. More importantly, Juniper represented something beyond transportation. Years on freight roads had taught Kellen that a working mule generated a surprising amount of heat. A large animal could produce warmth comparable to a small stove, provided the wind could not strip it away. He led Juniper toward the fallen pine. The space beneath the trunk was too low to bring the mule fully inside, but a narrow pocket existed beside the exposed root plate where the granite shelf curved inward. The location sat outside the main shelter while remaining protected from direct wind. That would have to do. Kellen stretched a spare section of canvas across the opening and reinforced it with pine boughs. The arrangement looked crude, yet the difference was immediate. Snow still drifted around the mule, but the worst of the coming blast would pass overhead rather than through it. Only then did he turn his attention back to the freight. Decisions came quickly. Medicine crates first. One sack of flour, the blanket, the candle, the tin cup, the tool roll. Each item disappeared into the shelter. The wrapped mill gear remained outside. Even before touching it, Kellen knew the truth. The piece was simply too heavy. Moving it beneath the pine would cost time he no longer possessed. A tarp covered the machinery instead. Additional snow berms were piled around it in the hope that morning might find it intact. Inside the shelter, he arranged the medicine crates against the driest section of granite. Then he pulled the blanket over them with surprising care. The gesture resembled the way a parent might cover a sleeping child before extinguishing a lamp. Beyond the shelter walls, the first real gust of the storm struck the mountain. The blizzard arrived all at once. One moment, snow drifted through the trees. The next, an entire wall of white swept across Granite Notch Pass. Wind slammed into the exposed root plate with enough force to shake loose chunks of frozen earth. It climbed over the fallen pine, curled around the trunk, and struck the shelter from every angle it could reach. Canvas snapped sharply. The wagon bed shuddered. Wood groaned. Outside, Juniper jerked against the rope at the first impact. The mule's breathing quickened, but panic never returned. The small windbreak around the side pocket held, for now. Inside the shelter, darkness settled quickly after Kellen extinguished the candle. There would be no fire, no lantern. Every bit of warmth mattered. He lay on one side with his back against the wagon wall and his shoulder pressed near the granite shelf. The space felt impossibly small, yet that smallness was part of its strength. Hours seemed to compress into sound. A whistle near one seam, a dull thump against the canvas, the scrape of drifting snow. Each noise carried information. Each one revealed where the storm was probing. Fine snow dust occasionally slipped through tiny openings. Then something unexpected happened. The leaks began disappearing. Snow accumulated against the outer branches. More snow collected against the berm. Wind pressed it tighter. Canvas stiffened as ice formed along its surface. Grass compressed. Dirt hardened. The storm continued its assault, but the shelter grew stronger beneath it. Then a sharp crack echoed overhead. The fallen pine shifted slightly. Kellen froze. One hand settled on the sideboard beside him. He listened. The mountain held its breath. So did he. Several long seconds passed before the tree settled again. The shelter remained intact. For another hour, at least, the judgment would continue. The first hour tested him more than any part of the journey. Exhaustion settled into his muscles the moment the hard labor stopped. Every movement inside the shelter required effort. The space was so narrow that stretching his legs fully was impossible. When he shifted position, a shoulder touched granite, or an elbow brushed the wagon wall. Comfort had never been part of the plan. Outside, the storm continued its work. Wind roared across the pass. Snow hissed against canvas. The pine groaned occasionally above him. Yet something began to change. Not outside. Inside. The air remained cold, but it no longer felt alive with movement. Each breath lingered for a moment, before fading. The sharp bite that accompanied moving wind had disappeared. That difference mattered. The dented tin cup beside him stayed free of ice longer than it should have. Water in the canteen tucked beneath his coat remained liquid. Beyond the wagon wall, Juniper's breathing gradually slowed into a steady rhythm. Those small signs carried more meaning than a thermometer ever could. The shelter was not producing heat. It was protecting what already existed. Hours earlier, the mountain had been stealing warmth as fast as anybody could create it. Now the theft had slowed, perhaps stopped. Kellen reached inside his coat and pulled out the folded debt paper. His fingers checked the edges carefully. Dry. Still dry. The sight brought no celebration. That paper represented a cabin in the valley, a woman who had repaired a worn canvas cover, a boy who believed a strip of leather could fix anything. The storm still surrounded him. The danger had not vanished. What the shelter provided was something more valuable. Time. And time was usually the first thing a blizzard took away. Sometime during the night, the storm changed its voice. The constant roar faded first. Hours later, even the sharp impacts against the shelter became less frequent. What remained was a distant moan moving across the higher ridges, as though the mountains were exhaling after a long struggle. A faint gray glow filtered through the frozen canvas. Morning. Kellen remained still for a few moments, listening. Nothing struck the wagon wall. Nothing rattled the pine above him. The judgment had ended. Using the handle of his hatchet, he chipped away at the packed snow sealing the entrance. Ice cracked loose in chunks. His boot heel broke through the remaining crust until enough space opened to crawl outside. The sight waiting beyond the shelter stopped him. Snow covered everything. The trail had vanished. The familiar shape of the pass no longer existed. Only white remained. The drift surrounding the fallen pine stood nearly chest-high in places. Much of the shelter had been buried beneath the very snow Kellen had hoped to capture. Farther downslope, the wagon's running gear protruded from a mound of drifted snow. One wheel remained visible. The rest had nearly disappeared. The wrapped mill gear still sat beneath its tarp. Frozen. Untouched. A movement near the root shelf drew his attention. Juniper lifted its head. Frost coated the mule's mane and shoulders, yet the animal's eyes remained clear and alert. Alive! Kellen released a slow breath. His legs protested when he tried to stand. Fatigue and cold robbed him of balance for a moment. One hand reached toward the wagon wall for support. Eventually he found his footing. The fallen pine had held. The broken wagon had held. The still air had held. Before turning toward the buried trail, Kellen placed his gloved hand against the scarred sideboard. A gentle tap followed. The gesture lasted only a second. Then he stepped away without saying a word. The storm had taken the wagon. It had not taken the delivery. Kellen spent part of the morning building a temporary travois from 2 side rails salvaged from the broken wagon. Rope held the frame together. Sections of canvas formed a dragging bed across the snow. The arrangement looked crude, but it moved. That was enough. Medicine crates went first. Lamp oil followed. Part of the flour shipment survived. After a long struggle, even the wrapped mill gear joined the load. Progress slowed to a crawl, yet every yard carried him closer to the mining camp. Juniper pulled steadily. The mule was tired. So was the man walking beside it. Nearly a full day late, they finally emerged from the snow and timber beyond Granite Notch. The mining camp appeared ahead through drifting smoke. Several workers stopped what they were doing when they saw the pair approach. Word traveled quickly. Most had assumed the freight was lost. Elias Crow, the camp quartermaster, stepped out from the supply shed and stared for several seconds. His eyes moved from Juniper to the improvised travois, then to the empty space where a wagon bed should have been. The missing section told its own story. Elias asked no questions. Not yet. Business came first. The freight was unloaded and inspected piece by piece. Medicine crates remained intact. Lamp oil survived. Enough flour arrived to matter. Even the mill gear reached camp, with only minor damage. At last, Elias opened his ledger. A pen scratched across paper. The delivery was recorded. The receipt was signed. Payment changed hands. That simple exchange carried more weight than any speech. Kellen accepted the folded receipt with fingers split and reddened by cold. For a moment, he looked at the document. Then his gaze shifted south. Beyond the mountains, beyond the pass, toward a small valley where a cabin, a woman, and a boy were waiting for him to come home. The trip home took longer than it should have. Snow had erased familiar landmarks. Drifts covered sections of road. More than once, Kellen found himself searching for terrain he had crossed dozens of times before. Meanwhile, stories traveled faster than wagons ever could. By the time he neared the valley, people were already saying that no man could have survived on Granite Notch Pass during the blizzard. Back at the cabin, Mara slept very little. The stove remained lit day and night. Each morning, Caleb walked to the door and stared toward the white hills beyond the fence. More than once, he asked whether his father might still be trapped beneath the snow somewhere in the mountains. Mara never answered directly. Instead, she kept Kellen's coat hanging near the door, as though he might step inside at any moment. Across town, Silas Greer had begun organizing papers. The deadline was approaching. A missed payment would settle the matter. Even Amos Rusk spoke less than usual. Lige Morrow carried the same uneasy silence. Both men knew the mountains well enough to understand what that storm had been capable of doing. Then, late one gray afternoon, Something moved along the snowy road leading into the valley. Caleb saw it first. A mule. Slow. Covered in frost. The improvised traces hung unevenly from its shoulders. "Mom!" he shouted. The boy bolted from the porch. His boots slipped almost immediately. He fell hard into the snow, scrambled back to his feet, and kept running. Behind the mule walked a man in a torn coat. One hand held the lead rope. The other rested against his chest, where the folded receipt remained tucked inside his coat. Mara stepped onto the porch. For a moment, she simply stared. The distance felt too great. The image too unlikely. Only when Kellen raised his head did she move. The steps disappeared beneath her. Snow scattered behind her boots. Caleb reached his father first. Kellen dropped to one knee, just as the boy collided with him. A second later, Mara arrived. Neither of them spoke. Her hands touched his face. Cold cracks marked his skin. Windburn darkened his cheeks. A healing cut crossed one eyebrow. She studied him for a moment, as if confirming he was real. Then she rested her forehead against his chest. The journey was finally over. The following morning, Kellen walked into Silas Greer's warehouse and placed the signed receipt beside the payment. Silas counted the money twice. The numbers refused to change. No loophole appeared. No argument remained. From across the room, Amos glanced toward the freight hauler. "What happened to the wagon?" Kellen folded the receipt and slipped it into his pocket. "Under a pine," he said, "where it did better work." A few days later, Amos and Lige rode up to Granite Notch Pass. The shelter was still there. A fallen ponderosa pine formed the roof. The wagon bed stood frozen into place as a wall. Mara's patched canvas had hardened with ice against layers of pine boughs. Grass-filled seams disappeared beneath snow packed tightly by the storm itself. The mountain had left the evidence untouched. Amos studied the structure for a long time. Luck had not saved Kellen. Neither had strength. The answer stood directly in front of him. The wind had searched all night for a way inside. It never found one. The storm buried the road. It did not bury the man.